Looking back on SpongeBob SquarePants, there's just so much I absolutely adore about this show, especially the earlier seasons. But if I'm being honest, it's one that ever since I was a kid left me with questions. What is the Krabby Patty secret formula? How did Sandy's tree dome get down there? Is mayonnaise an instrument? And possibly the biggest of all, where did Pearl come from? How did a crab end up being father to a whale? And whatever happened to her mother? The latter three questions we're gonna dive into today, but before we do, I just wanted to say thank you so much for clicking on this video and for being here. I appreciate you more than words could ever say, and pretty please, if you enjoy this video, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss my future videos. Also, if you're already subscribed and familiar with my videos, you might notice that this one's a lot different from how my content is usually structured, but I thought it'd be fun to try something new, so here we are. On today's nostalgic walk down memory lane, we're gonna look at the relationship between Mr. Krabs and his daughter Pearl under a magnifying glass as I break down my theory of Pearl's origin story. Before we explore the mysterious origins of Pearl, however, we need to peel back a few layers and dive a bit into a different topic. That would be none other than Mr. Krabs' love life. The weird thing about this show is that the only love interest that's ever really shown for Mr. Krabs is Mrs. Puff. We don't know if he's ever been with anyone else, and there isn't really any mention of a Mrs. Krabs at any point. I really don't recall any time in the series that they pointed to Mr. Krabs having any other love interest. As far as Mrs. Puff herself goes, there's a few things that we know about her. Sure, she's SpongeBob's boating school teacher, and she's romantically interested in Mr. Krabs, but on top of that, we know that she isn't afraid to break the law. We see this firsthand in the episode No Free Rides, when she tries to steal SpongeBob's brand new boat that was gifted to him from his parents. We've also seen her full-blown go to jail on multiple occasions, hall monitor and doing time. Speaking of no free rides though, in this episode, Mrs. Puff would make a statement that's very ominous in nature.
I'll have to move to a new city, start a new boating school with a new name. No, not again.
Now, this right here tells us that Mrs. Puff isn't afraid to start a new life in a new town and open a new boating school, and as a matter of fact, it wouldn't be the first time that she's done it. Now, this would leave us questioning, what was it that she did in the past that made her feel the need to completely uproot her life and flee to another city? Now, circling back to Mr. Krabs, we know a lot more about him than we do about Mrs. Puff, if we're being frank. We know that he's a single dad to Pearl, and that he's the cheapskate owner of the Krusty Krab, of course. However, we know that he also isn't afraid to break the law. We've seen him do many questionable and potentially illegal things, but the biggest one to come to mind is the time that him and SpongeBob thought that they murdered a health inspector, so Mr. Krabs decides that they're gonna bury him in a shallow grave. Outside of that one, we've seen him attempt to break the law many times. He's attempted to murder Squidward so that he could make money off of his paintings when he's gone, in the episode Out of the Picture. We've seen him mentally torture Plankton for 16 days straight, to the point where Plankton lays in the road to end his own life in the episode One Course Meal. And of course, we've seen him break many labor laws, for example, making his employees work 24-hour shifts for 43 days straight. Now, in comparison to Mrs. Puff, there isn't really any point where he mentions starting a new life or anything that extreme, but it's worth pointing out that he, as well, definitely isn't a stranger to illegal activity. Now hear me out here. What if, nearly 2 decades ago, Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff lived a completely different life in a different city? It may seem rather far-fetched, but there is some evidence that might just point to this potentially being the case. If we look back at the episode Krusty Love that aired all the way back in 2002, it's established that Mr. Krabs is in love with Mrs. Puff. She walks into the Krusty Krab and he falls head over heels in love with her. For him, it was love at first sight. Or so we thought. In this episode, he portrays that he doesn't know who she is and that this is his first time seeing and meeting her. But what if for just a second we stop and think that maybe this is all an act and that they've actually known each other a lot longer than that? This very well could be the case, and I might just be able to prove it. If we fast forward all the way to season 10, in the episode Whirly Brains, which aired in 2016, it's revealed that Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff have been dating for 16 years now. Which most of us thought was implying that they just never stopped seeing each other after the events of Krusty Love, the episode in which we were told that they first met. However, what's odd is that the timeline here simply doesn't add up. If this really was them saying that they're going based on the same timeline as us here in the real world are, then 16 years before this episode aired would have been the year 2000. And that wouldn't make much sense considering the episode that we're shown them meeting in, again, aired in 2002, which would have meant they would have been dating for 14 years, not 16. What if, though, they were actually trying to tell us something else? What if this actually wasn't a callback to Krusty Love? The thing is, it wouldn't make sense for this show to have really taken place over the course of the last 25 years. Over the last 2.5 decades that we've been watching this show, we've never really seen anyone get older. Everyone in this show seems to stay the same age. If time really was passing between episodes, it's likely that a lot of these creatures would no longer be alive, especially Sandy, considering the average life of a squirrel is 5 to 6 years. With that in mind though, I have to point out that a majority of cartoons don't operate on real-life timelines. Typically in cartoons, the characters don't get any older, and it's like they're stuck in this never-ending time loop where they just kind of stay in the same general time range, but different things happen with every story told. With that in mind, it's odd that in Whirly Brains there's a comment made about Mrs. Puff and Mr. Krabs having been dating for the past 16 years. Taking it at face value implies that despite the characters not aging or the world around them advancing much, they're still recognizing the passing of time throughout all of the years that we've been watching this show. If I'm being honest, that just doesn't make much sense to me. Instead, however, what if we take it as the show's writers hinting to them having been dating for 16 years prior to the start of this show, and the time loop that we've been watching circulate for the last 25 years? This may not seem like it at first. However, the more you contemplate it, the more heinous and morbid implications it starts to point towards. Now, we have to keep in mind one key thing that really puts a lot of this into perspective and kind of brings us to the point at hand. Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff have been dating for 16 years. Meanwhile, his daughter Pearl is 16 years old. This would mean that they've been dating since right about the time she was born. Now, you might be wondering, what does that have to do with their origin story? And, well, let me just paint a bit of a picture for you. A picture that tells the tale of a beautiful love story. A story that starts out a little more than 16 years ago in a place far, far away from Bikini Bottom. Mr. Krabs, a few years out from his service in the war, has yet to buy the retirement home that he would later convert into the Krusty Krab. He's still in a deep, dark depression. However, he would find a bright and warm light in his life when he meets Mrs. Puff. Much like the scene they portrayed in the Krusty Krab, it was love at first sight. From the moment he laid eyes on her, he knew that she was the one for him. He ends up winning her heart as the two fall madly in love with one another very quickly. It's not long before they begin to build a life together. They purchase a house together as Mrs. Puff focuses on her newly opened boating school, which she pours her heart and soul into. Meanwhile, Mr. Krabs unfortunately still struggles deeply with his depression rather often, despite his new and rapidly escalating love. Now, as we continue our theoretical story from there, time continues on and we see Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff wanting to grow their family further. The two long to have a child together, however, the unfortunate truth is that it's just not possible for a crab and a pufferfish to have biological babies. This right here would leave them with only one option: adopting a baby. That would be the easiest solution to all of their troubles. However, there would be a few problems along the way. In the process of adopting a child, there's a ton of paperwork involved on the back end, as well as background checks, which at this point might not have been easy for them to pass, considering that they're again very willing to break the law. On top of that, in a lot of cases, adopting a child costs a substantial amount of money, and we all know that Mr. Krabs, being how he is, definitely isn't willing to spend money on anything, even if it's for the benefit of growing his family. Lastly, and possibly the biggest problem facing them, would be the fact that adopting a child takes a lot of time. And, well, we all know that Puffy needs a new pair of shoes, and Mr. Krabs doesn't want to leave her waiting, if you know what I mean. Okay, so we've already established that both Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff aren't afraid to break the law. We've seen them do it multiple times over the years, and odds are they likely both did it in the years before the show took place. Furthermore, we've established our understanding as to why Mr. Krabs wouldn't want to wait for the adoption process to run its course. From there, it only leads to one simple choice for them to make: abducting a child for them to raise together. Without a doubt, that may not be the easiest way, but it's definitely the quickest and cheapest way for someone willing to break the law to obtain a child. Now, I know that may seem drastic, but hear me out here. It's no secret that both Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff are prone to having panic moments where they don't quite think things through with their whole brain. In a panicked and manic state like that, it's easy to make an impulsive decision that might not be a good one to make. On top of that though, they're both known for doing potentially unhinged things. All of these things brew together to make the perfect storm where, in the heat of the moment, with his wife yearning to have a baby to raise, and him having an empty, dark hole inside of him that he's been trying desperately to fill, snatching Pearl from her mother seemed like an easy yet desperate decision to make. One big thing to keep in mind though is that we're talking about 16 years ago. Back then, there were still security cameras in a lot of places. I mean, we're talking about potentially when Pearl could have been a newborn baby, and in all reality, I don't think it's very easy to get away with kidnapping a newborn baby from a hospital. Even if maybe they did it when she was about 2 years old, let's say, doing that in a store would have been a really hard thing to get away with. Sure, they may have found a way to get away with it at first, but even then, it was always only a matter of time until one of their neighbors noticed something was off, or someone identified them as the kidnappers. With all those things in mind, eventually, Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff would definitely end up being recognized at some point and reported to the police. This would result in them going on the run from the law with Pearl in their custody, with uncertain plans for the future. Living a life on the run, never staying in one place for too long out of fear of being caught, it's an exhausting way to live. It's one that's hard to keep up over long periods of time. After a while, they would eventually find themselves stumbling upon a new town where they would yet again attempt to set up roots. starting a new life under new names, and of course, Mrs. Puff opening a new boating school. This town would be none other than Bikini Bottom. However, this time, things would have to be different. Along the way, you may have been thinking all along, if this was the case and they really did all of this, why wouldn't they stay together and start a new family in Bikini Bottom? Well, that topic would add a whole nother layer of sadness to this story. Now, the first problem with that is the fact that a family consisting of a crab, a pufferfish, and a whale is a very uncommon pairing to see in Bikini Bottom and under the sea altogether. I mean, if we think back to all of the families of different fish that we've seen over the years in this show, we've never once seen a family that was blended in even a remotely similar way to that. On top of that, though, B, a child abduction is a massive deal. Children going missing are often multi-state, if not national headlines, depending on the circumstances and situation involved. Now, with that in mind, it wouldn't just be the people from their previous city that they lived in who would be on the lookout for them. It would be essentially as far as the newsroom could get the word, which is incredibly far. In the process of being on the run, moving to a different city, and trying to set up a new life, they both knew that they would stick out like a sore pink thumb as a family unit, which would make them easily identifiable and trace them to the crime that they had committed. Individually, however, they would have a lot higher chance of being able to lay low and get away with the crime that they had heinously committed. Along the way of planning this, though, they would reach a point where a choice would need to be made, and unfortunately, one of them would be forced to make the ultimate sacrifice. They would come to the conclusion that Mr. Krabs would keep Pearl and raise her while Mrs. Puff would focus on her boating school business, waiting until a day would come that long enough time had passed for them to once again be together as one. From there, the years would keep passing, and we would see Mr. Krabs raising Pearl as his own, happy that having a daughter to care for would finally make his life feel more complete. The depression that he struggled with for years would finally subside as he has a new light in his life. One that not only makes him happy, but requires his constant attention and love to stay alive. It was his love for his daughter that would bring him out of his darkest days. His love for her would lead to him wanting to make the best life possible for her. In an effort to do that, he would end up doing the one thing that Mr. Krabs never does: spending money. He would purchase the old Rusty Krab retirement home and renovate it into the Krusty Krab restaurant as he pursues the food industry in the name of providing a better life for his daughter. Now, I'm sure all of this seems like it could be a massive stretch. Of course, I won't deny that. But with that being said, you have to admit that the signs are there if you look in the right places, and my theory presented here could very well be the case. We don't know if kidnapping Pearl would be the first foray into breaking the law for Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff. However, we do know that it definitely would not be the last, as both would go on to break laws more later on in life. Now, as I mentioned earlier, as far as I recall, there's never really any mention of a Mrs. Krabs at all throughout the series whatsoever, other than Eugene Krabs' mother. However, I certainly want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that we do get a mention of Mr. Puff in the series by none other than Mr. Krabs, surprisingly enough. In the episode Krusty Love, when Mr. Krabs meets Mrs. Puff for the first time, allegedly, Mr. Krabs asks SpongeBob this question.
Mrs. Puff? Oh, she's married.
Oh no, Mr. Krabs, she's single.
Then what happened to Mr. Puff?
She doesn't like to talk about it.
Now, this right here is something that I always thought was a hilarious gag. But it's interesting to take in with this context. It's implied that SpongeBob doesn't really know what happened to Mr. Puff because she doesn't like to talk about it. But to us, the viewer, it's implied that Mr. Puff was caught by the hooks and turned into a lamp. In all reality though, this very well could be her cover-up. Hear me out here. I'd imagine if she had gone through so much with Mr. Krabs and jumped through so many hoops to obtain Pearl just to end up having to watch her grow up from afar, she would be feeling quite a bit of sorrow and pain. I can't blame her for telling people that she doesn't want to talk about it because, frankly, I bet it hurts quite a bit. On that note though, when people try to pry further, she likely explains that Mr. Puff was a pufferfish who got caught by the hooks as a cover-up for the real stone-cold truth that she's been covering up for all these years. Now, as far as Pearl is concerned, her role in all of this is one that's really morbid, all things considered. She doesn't even know that any of this would have happened to her. She lives what she believes is a normal life, likely under the impression that she was adopted by Mr. Krabs, but nevertheless, she loves Mr. Krabs as her father because he's the man who raised her. Pearl's role in this whole story is one that certainly comes across as a double-edged sword, all things considered. On the bright side, she lives a happy life with the man that she believes is her dad, and he really loves her. But on the dark side, she doesn't know who her real parents are, and odds are she will never know, as she seems to live in blissful ignorance to the fact that she's a whale and her dad is a crab, never really seeming to question it. In conclusion, this theory is one that I'm willing to put out there because it's one that I feel really has at least partially some ground to stand on. I've seen a few different theories about Pearl's origin story out there, claiming that Mr. Krabs saved her after her mom was murdered by poachers, claiming that she was found after her mother was killed in the Bikini Bottom War, or even going as far as claiming that he's actually her sugar daddy. All of which are pretty outlandish, and mine is definitely up there with them in the harebrained conspiracy factor. But with that being said, you never know. There could be a hint of truth in all of these theories brought to the table. But what do you think? Did this theory change your perception on the possible origin story of Pearl Krabs? Let me know in the comments down below. I always love seeing your guys' feedback. Of course, I have to give a huge, gigantic, ginormous shout out with so much love to my patrons over on Patreon, especially those of you in the true 90s Kids tier. I truly appreciate you so much, and I really can't thank you enough for your continued support. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like and give a little praise to the algorithm in hopes that it pushes this one to everyone else. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.